Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the Battle of Philippi by Historia Civilis. So, last time we saw Cicero's attempt to balance the conspirators against the Caesarians. At one point he sided with Octavian and the conspirators against Mark Antony, who seemed to be the biggest threat. Unfortunately, last time's episode ended with Cicero being murdered as Octavian joined up with Mark Antony and Lepidus to form the Second Triumvirate, and the conspirators were stuck east, controlling the eastern provinces, and we basically seemed poised for a civil war. And I reckon we're probably getting to that this time. The Triumvirate versus the conspirators, though the Triumvirate itself is pretty shaky. You know, those three guys, I think, will be pretty quick to turn on each other when they get the opportunity. So, just a quick note on future reactions. I recently did a poll asking you guys what you would want to see after I finish Historia Civilis' Roman history videos, because we're getting pretty close to the end. And the winner, by far, was History March's Hannibal series. So after we finish Historia Civilis' History of Rome videos, we will be reacting to History March's series on Hannibal. I'm excited for that one, and there are way more Roman history videos planned in the future. I do not intend to stop Roman history after I'm done with Historia Civilis. I love Roman history, and there's always more to cover. Anyway, if you guys end up enjoying this video, I would appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon or channel memberships for exclusive reaction content, including exclusive Historia Civilis reactions. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
On January 1st of 42 B.C.E., the Senate and people of Rome declared Julius Caesar a god.
Yeah, well, we saw, following Caesar's death, that the conspirators' idea that he had made himself unpopular through his authoritarianism was very incorrect. Sure, the people of Rome didn't like the authoritarian actions Caesar was taking, but it was clear he was still incredibly popular, and I think his death only made him more popular. And since his death, his legacy has continued to grow. He was a religious figure in his lifetime, he filled religious roles, but now they are truly venerating him as a god. And this is a trend, by the way, that will continue with future Roman emperors. As time goes on, they will go further from just being a normal guy at the top of the system to becoming basically what are gods on earth, or demigods on earth, or whatever you want to call it. They'll become further separated from being normal humans and closer to gods. Caesar's getting that treatment right now, but only after his death, right? So this is sort of an interesting note and something that will set a precedent for the future in some ways.
A temple was to be built on the site of his funeral pyre, which was now sacred ground, and Mark Antony was to serve as that temple's chief priest. The legislation was introduced by Lepidus on his first day as consul. This year, 42, would be a pivotal year for Rome. It would finally resolve the split between the triumvirs and the conspirators, and that resolution would serve as a launching pad for a complete political realignment in Rome.
So as I said in the intro, it seems like this time we're getting the triumvirs versus the conspirators. But, as I think Historia Civilis is hinting at, a realignment of Roman politics and political alliances, the triumvirate is very shaky itself, right? Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian, their alliance is not really solid, particularly Octavian and Mark Antony. I mean, only last time we saw it, they were enemies. It was Cicero and Octavian versus Mark Antony, and now they've joined up, so their alliance is more one of convenience, or one against a common enemy. I think the second they don't have to deal with the conspirators, or maybe it'll happen even before that, these guys are all going to turn on each other.
The triumvirs consisted of Caesar's new chief priest, Antony, Caesar's former second-in-command and consul for that year, Lepidus, and Caesar's adopted son, Octavian.
Octavian, Caesar's true heir, as selected by Caesar, but in the triumvirate, he is the junior partner. He is the one with the least amount of power. Of course, those of us who are familiar with Roman history, you guys know that Octavian will rise to the top. He will win this battle. If we look at this whole thing as one long political battle. But at the moment, it doesn't really look like he's going to win the battle. I mean, he's certainly powerful. He's one of the most powerful men in the empire, but Lepidus and Mark Antony are certainly more powerful than he is, more influential.
The conspirators, led by Brutus, Cassius, and all the remaining members of the successful conspiracy to assassinate.
And previously that would have been Brutus, Cassius, and Decimus, but last time Cicero was murdered, and so was Decimus, both in rather ignoble ways.
Caesar were off in the east, in command of a truly massive army that was growing by the day. A showdown seemed inevitable.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's like we've reverted back a couple years, back to the Caesar versus Pompey civil war. We've got the conspirators stationed out east, like Pompey was. They're controlling a lot of the eastern territories, and then the Caesarians out west. Of course, it is a very different situation in that it's not just Caesar versus Pompey, it's the conspirators versus the triumvirate, and the triumvirate among themselves control different territories. So it's an even more complicated picture.
After the death of Cicero, Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian stood unopposed in Italy. But
yeah, Cicero was the bulwark against, I guess, what we could call Caesarian influence. Because the conspirators had basically been chased out of Rome. They were pretty unpopular after murdering Caesar. But, as we saw last time, and there were a lot of great comments on the last video about this, Cicero was trying to operate on old notions of Roman republicanism. He was trying not to be authoritarian, trying not to use force and violence. Not to say he never did those things, but he certainly didn't want to. He wanted to return to an earlier era of Roman republicanism, right? And unfortunately, at this point, those ideas are very outdated. Anyone with any sort of influence has to use force and authoritarian power grabs to get what they want. And Cicero just couldn't or refused to adapt to that. And now he's gone. And his influence is gone. So now Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian can basically do whatever they want within the western portion of the Roman Empire.
But now they were faced with a new, grim reality. After years of civil war, the Roman treasury was empty. Even worse, there was no new money coming in, because Rome's most profitable provinces were in the hands of the conspirators. The financial situation was in a tailspin. The triumvirs had no...
Yeah, well, Roman politics and the Roman state was funded by some wealthy provinces, and so if you lost control of those, that would be a problem. And the Roman state was also funded by conquest. Conquest of territory, bringing it into the empire, extracting wealth. That would also bring a lot of money. But since the empire has been infighting for years at this point, I mean, we had the first civil war with Caesar and Pompey. We've had a lot of political chaos since then, the murder of Caesar. We're basically heading into another civil war. There hasn't really been a ton of time to conquer new territories.
No choice but to introduce a series of new taxes on Roman citizens.
Yeah, that's
the
unpopular.
Fact that they were on Roman citizens is significant, because Romans were accustomed to paying virtually no taxes.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I said. They got their taxes from certain provinces and conquest. Taxing Roman citizens was pretty rare and incredibly unpopular. I mean, taxes aren't popular today, new taxes, but imagine if you're a Roman citizen who's accustomed to paying almost no taxes, and all of a sudden, these three new authoritarians who were ruling over you, they bring in new taxes. I mean, that you're not going to like that at all. That's going to make these three guys, the triumvirs, who have already committed a lot of brutality and violence, even less popular. Though, if you speak out, you might end up getting arrested or killed.
The provinces were so lucrative that they alone usually generated enough income to support Rome's growing empire. But now, under Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian, that had to change. One of these new taxes was a one-time levy on the 1,400 wealthiest women in Rome.
Okay.
The triumvirs cited some vague historical precedent for this, pointing back to sometime during the Punic Wars, when wealthy women helped raise a new army by donating their valuables. Historically, we don't know any of the details regarding this incident, so we kinda just have to take their word for it.
This is very strange. Why specifically on the 1,400 wealthiest women? Maybe not to upset their political allies? I have no idea. I mean, I can understand a one-time tax on the wealthiest people in Rome. This was not necessarily an uncommon thing throughout history. If the state or the king or whoever's in charge really needed money, you might do a one-time tax or a loan, aka a forced loan, on your aristocrats or your wealthiest residents. I've never seen a one-time tax on the wealthiest women in particular, especially given the fact that, of course, men tended to have more wealth and more influence in public life than women did. So I'm very curious as to why this was.
The wealthy women of Rome found the comparison to the Punic Wars outrageous. This was nothing like the Punic Wars. Rome was not under threat of being conquered. The triumvirs were the ones pushing for open conflict.
And I do make a good point. We're not at threat from an external cause. We're at threat from ourselves. We're at the verge of a civil war.
Now suddenly they needed the people of Rome to bail them out? This was a political movement in the making, and it coalesced behind a charismatic leader named Hortensia, the daughter of one of Rome's greatest orators. Under Hortensia, the wealthy women of Rome went behind the backs of the triumvirs and began to undermine their political support.
Interesting. Now, I don't know too much about women's role in Roman politics and Roman life in general. Of course, I do know that as for a lot of time in Western history, it was more acceptable for men to be in public life. I mean, when we talk about generals and senators and Roman politicians, it's always 100% men. And like I said, that is true for a lot of Western history up to, pretty recently, right? There are some exceptions, of course. There are many exceptions, but it's more a general rule. But that doesn't mean that women weren't influential in other ways. Behind the scenes, interacting with people in private conversations, interacting with other women, dealing with the household, dealing with the household finances. Like I said, I don't know too much about Roman women in particular, but there are a lot of ways that women could be influential, even if they primarily were barred from public life, or public politics at least.
They approached Octavian's sister Octavia and convinced her to join their cause.
And this, like I just mentioned, is one of those ways, interacting with other prominent women, someone like Octavia, who can then go to Octavian and try to convince him.
Antony's mother Julia, and won her support as well.
There you go.
They approached Antony's wife Fulvia, and she was extremely abrasive, and turned them away at the door.
Damn.
How rude.
That is pretty rude. I was going to say, if you can get Antony as wife and mother, there's no way he could say no to what they want. Imagine both your wife and your mother come to you and say, don't do this tax. You're like, okay, I won't do it. But I guess Fulvia wasn't into it.
Hortensia then led a group of women down to the forum to protest and disrupt a public meeting. Antony, Lepidus, and...
Now that does seem pretty bold. Now maybe some of you can tell me more about women's role in public life in Rome. Maybe they had more of a role in public life than they would, say, in early modern Europe, in which they were mostly confined to the private sector and the household. Because this seems extremely bold to me, but maybe this isn't as rare as I think.
Octavian were all in attendance. As the women pushed their way into the crowd, their presence caused a small commotion. Their leader Hortensia raised her voice and addressed the crowd. She began by referencing the prescriptions, which was when the triumvirs ordered the deaths of thousands of their political enemies and confiscated their property.
Oh, wait a minute.
You have already deprived...
Whoa. I mean, I'm going to let her finish, but this seems extremely dangerous. I mean, not just for a woman, but for anybody. For anybody in Rome to get up in front of a gathering at which the triumvirs are present and criticize the prescriptions, which, I mean, a lot of people don't like because they were so brutal and violent, but I feel like you are seriously putting your life at risk. I mean, shout out to Hortensia. She's definitely brave, but this is very risky, I feel.
deprived us of our fathers, our sons, our husbands, and our brothers, whom you accused of having wronged you. If we have done you wrong, as you say our husbands have,
wow.
prescribe us as you do them. But if we women have not voted you any public enemies, have not torn down your houses, destroyed your army, or led another against you, why do we share the penalty when we do not share the guilt? Why should we pay taxes when we have no part in the honors, the commands, the statecraft, for which you contend against each other with such harmful results?
I mean, first off, this is an argument which we will see pop up again much, much later if we're talking about sort of modern or early modern feminism. Very interesting. Well, this is also basically a no taxation without representation type argument. Now, of course, these are the most influential and wealthiest women in Rome, but what they're saying is, look, we don't have any formal role in Roman politics. We don't lead the armies. We don't contribute to the statecraft. And yet you're trying to tax us? How is that fair? If you think we're responsible for this, just kill us like you did our husbands and fathers and brothers. I think it's a good argument. I wonder how the triumvirs and the crowd is going to react, because I think it's very convincing, but I do still think it's quite risky.
Because this is a time of war, do you say? When have there not been wars? And when have taxes ever been imposed on women? Our mothers did once make contributions when you were in danger of losing the whole empire and the city itself through the conflict with the Carthaginians. But then they contributed voluntarily, not from their landed property, but from their own jewelry, not by force and violence, but what they themselves were willing to give. What alarm is there now for the empire or for the country?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if these women during the Punic Wars did give voluntarily. Like Historia Civilis said, it seems we don't know too much about this event. But what I do think is true, and this is also what I mentioned, is that is an external threat to the empire. This is not an external threat to the empire. This is internal. I mean, this is Romans against Romans. So it's not like an active time of war or an active enemy threat. So, I mean, I agree, it's a lot less justifiable to ask, or to demand, actually, this tax on the wealthiest women.
Let war with the Gauls or the Parthians come, and we shall protect the public as our mothers did. But we will never contribute to your civil wars.
It's interesting, by the way, that they mentioned the Gauls. The Parthians make sense, longtime rival of the Romans, but the Gauls, who are now technically part of the Roman Empire. They have been part of the empire for years at this point and are slowly integrating. I mean, there are Gallic senators at this point, but I guess Caesar's Gallic campaigns are still on everybody's minds, and so the Gauls are one of the examples they went to. That's a little thing, but sometimes little references can tell you a lot about how people think.
It was a powerful speech, and there were some really interesting ideas in there.
Yeah.
Why should we pay taxes when we have no part in statecraft?
Yep.
Hortensia was hinting at women entering politics. Revolutionary stuff.
Like I said, this is stuff that we would see repeated, 15, 16, 17, 1800 years later with early modern into modern feminism. Very interesting stuff.
Somebody ordered the lictors to move in and remove the women from the forum. They resisted, and all of a sudden, there was screaming and shoving and violence.
Jesus.
Onlookers cried out in support, and many of them rushed in to join the fight.
Oh, man.
Within moments...
This has devolved into mob violence, basically. But, yeah, I mean, as we know, it's always a bad idea to, one, forcefully remove protesters, but especially to forcefully remove women protesters. I mean, with the gender rules that we have today, or that they had in Rome, the men in the crowd are not going to like that. And so you send in the lictors to forcefully remove these women. Now you have the entire crowd mobilized against you.
There was a full-on brawl in the forum. The next day, the triumvirs backed down. A nominal tax would stay in place, but the amount of money levied would be reduced by over 70%. Hortensia and her supporters had won.
Wow. Yeah, I'm really glad Historia Civilis included that. That's just a really interesting note in Roman politics, and, I mean, particularly the role of women in Roman politics. Really fascinating stuff.
But the triumvirate still needed revenue if they were going to raise additional legions. They imposed a sweeping new wealth tax on Roman citizens. But even that wasn't enough. They would have to look beyond Rome and squeeze even harder. They announced that going forward, Italian farmers would be required to give half of their harvest to the state.
Jesus.
Farmers weren't that rich to begin with, and so many were faced with a choice between operating at a loss or simply walking away from their farms.
This is rough, man. We've gone from almost no taxes on Roman citizens to some pretty heavy taxation on wealthy people, but also on a lot of farmers who cannot afford it. I think realistically, I mean, they need some source of income in the short term, but really the only way to get the state's finances in order is to beat the conspirators and finally restore order and normalcy to the Roman Empire. You know, that's what's caused this loss of finances, all of this political chaos, and the only way to return Roman finances to a better state is to end the political chaos. But, right, they need finances in the short term. They'll need money to prosecute the war against Brutus and Cassius, so it is a difficult position, definitely.
Agricultural yields plummeted. The price of food went through the roof. The entire region fell into an economic depression.
Yeah, not
The
great.
concept of economics had not been invented yet, and it shows. But the triumvirs were destroying the Roman economy for a reason. Brutus and Cassius...
Sure, but, you know, I feel like a lot of people probably could have seen what was coming, right? This was more of a situation of, you know, they were in a tough situation, and they felt like they had to do this. I'm not sure what the other options would have been, but, you know, economics hadn't been invented yet. But I'm sure they knew there would be adverse effects to imposing these taxes.
Were still in the east, in command of one of the largest armies ever fielded by Rome.
Yeah.
But this was also expensive. Brutus and Cassius imposed their own extreme demands on their occupied territory, and when the locals refused, their cities were stormed and looted. And
Yeah, you're not gonna... Oh, God. Stuff's going so badly throughout the Empire. You know, what Brutus and Cassius need, by the way, is support for their cause. You're not going to get much support doing that. It's also interesting, by the way, that same as Pompey, Cassius and Brutus fled to the east and set up in the eastern provinces. I mean, it just shows us how wealthy and, in some ways, independent the eastern provinces were. Independent in that, I mean, they were very much tied to the rest of the Roman Empire, but they could function independently. That's why Pompey fled to the east. It was a powerful and wealthy base of support that could function separate from the rest of the empire, and Brutus and Cassius have done the same. I feel like it gives us a little bit of an insight into the future division between the west and the east. Clearly, the east has always sort of had its own thing going on, which we've known from the beginning because, you know, of the Greek influence throughout the empire, but particularly in the east. Greek language, literature, culture, philosophy. So it is kind of interesting to see that in action over the last several years of Roman politics.
the inhabitants were enslaved. This happened at least thrice, in Judea, in Lycia, and on the island of Rhodes.
Jeez.
They were building alliances as well. A bunch of independent kingdoms agreed to support the conspirators and send cavalry, which was sorely needed.
Yeah,
Brutus
okay.
and Cassius sent the son of Caesar's old right-hand man Labienus all the way to Parthia, where an agreement was reached.
Oh, wow.
The Parthians sent archers, and the son of Labienus stayed to continue negotiations.
I did not think we would see Labienus' name pop up, honestly, ever again after Caesar defeated him in battle.
By June of the year 42, Brutus and Cassius felt that they were ready. Together, they had 17 legions under their command.
Whoa,
For
okay.
comparison, when Caesar defeated Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus, it was Caesar's 7 legions against Pompey's 8. Brutus
Yeah.
and Cassius had 17.
Holy. And I remember at the time we were talking about 7, 8, occasionally at times 10 legions, though not in actual combat. And I remember we were saying, God damn, that's a lot of legions. Brutus and Cassius have 17. I mean, that is a tidal wave of Roman soldiers. I feel like they could come crashing down in the Italian peninsula and just wipe out anyone before them. So I'm curious to see how this all goes.
If all the legions were at full strength, it would have worked out to 85,000 infantry, plus 20,000 allied cavalry, plus the Parthian archers. They moved this massive army into the Roman province of Macedonia and waited. The scale of Brutus and Cassius's army freaked out the triumvirs, which is why they took those unprecedented steps to raise money. And it worked. By the summer of 42...
Okay, that is making a little bit more sense. I mean, I did say at the time, I understand that they need short-term funds in order to defeat the conspirators, but knowing that the conspirators had 17 legions, you can understand and empathize a little bit more with the triumvirs, with all of these desperate attempts at taxation and trying to raise money, because, I mean, not only did they need these short-term funds, but they were probably getting extremely worried about what Brutus and Cassius were about to do.
2. Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian were sitting on 19 legions.
Oh my
95,000 soldiers if they were at full strength, plus 13,000 allied cavalry.
Holy, we're talking about an incredible amount of people. I mean, at full strength, we're basically talking about 200,000 men. Now, they probably weren't at full strength, so not that many. But this is an incredible mobilization. I mean, once again, compare it to Caesar and Pompey, and at the time, that looked like an incredible mobilization. This is just at another level.
By the way, it's impossible to know the actual size of these armies. It was quite normal for older and more experienced legions to operate at half strength for years at a time. Some people do the work of tracking the age and estimated losses of each individual legion, but even these numbers are deceptive, since an experienced legion at half strength could easily defeat an inexperienced legion at full strength. So even if you had the raw numbers, you would still be missing vital information. People love to fight over this, but honestly, don't worry about it.
Yeah, I think in the grand scheme, it doesn't matter too much what the specific number of men was. At full strength, including allied archers and cavalry, we would have about 200,000 combatants. In reality, we probably have somewhere between, I'd say, 90,000 and 200,000. Maybe like 150, 140, I don't know. But still an incredibly large number of people.
Antony and Octavian assumed a joint command and moved east. Lepidus would remain behind to oversee Rome as consul. They would need 2 trips to transport their entire army across the Adriatic. Antony went first and Octavian followed. Of the 4 generals converging on Macedonia, Antony and Cassius were the most experienced. Antony had served under Caesar in Gaul, and Cassius had served against the Parthians in the east.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've got a lot of critique for Mark Antony, and I've made that criticism very clear throughout this series, but if there is one thing I do give to Mark Antony, it is that he was a pretty experienced and talented general. I mean, we saw last time he made some pretty impressive moves. You know, he had a pretty good strategy. He was holding his own against a numerically superior number of men. So I will give that to Antony. He definitely has some military talent. He can bungle things at time, but, you know, I'll give that to him. Octavian, on the other hand, has very little military experience, and as we will see, I think, in the coming episodes, he was always far more into political strategy than military strategy.
Brutus and Octavian were pretty much rookies.
Yeah, and kind of like Octavian, Brutus was far more into the political side of things. So I think we have sort of a fair comparison between the two different figures on each side.
And it showed. On the trip across the Adriatic, Octavian fell seriously ill. We do not know the nature of this illness, and honestly, I'm not even sure that it was real. Octavian did not like being on campaign.
He didn't. He wasn't very good at military stuff, and he didn't like it either. But it is and maybe he was faking, I think that's what Historia Civilis is implying. It is my understanding that Octavian often was in poor health, though. I don't know if it was particularly in his early years, but I certainly hear about it more before he became emperor. Maybe that's just because we didn't hear about it when he became emperor. But it does seem like he was often in poor health or unwell. So I think it definitely could have been real.
And he had a history of falling ill at convenient times. A similar thing happened once when he accompanied Caesar to Spain.
Yes, but, he had a history of falling unwell at convenient times. Could also just be he had a history of falling unwell. I don't think he had a very strong constitution, right? But there's always the possibility that he was kind of faking or putting it on. I don't know. I would sort of lean more towards, I do think he was actually frequently unwell.
Octavian would spend the rest of the campaign either in his tent or being carried on a litter. His subordinates commanded the legions for him. And honestly, it might have been for the best, since he had no military experience
It
anyway.
probably was for the best.
As the two sides converged near the city of Philippi, Brutus and Cassius's fleet implemented a blockade. For Antony and Octavian, resupply or reinforcements were now out of the question.
Jeez.
They would need to attack before they ran out of food. There was now a ticking clock.
I mean, this is a very Caesar-esque scenario they put themselves into. This very much reminds me of any number of Caesar's conquests where he moves in to defeat an enemy, although often Caesar's enemies were numerically superior. He doesn't have enough supplies, he's on a time limit, and he has to get the job done. That's kind of the situation that Antony and Octavian are in.
Brutus and Cassius had the high ground and were encamped in a strong position. They were protected by mountains to the north, by marshes to the south, were well supplied from the sea, and had a line of fortifications in front of them. Brutus and Cassius were each in command of a group of legions that were completely independent from each other, as if they were two separate armies. This was probably a mistake, but they...
Yeah, I mean, that can make your entire force more mobile, but it also makes them less unified. And lack of cohesion can be a big problem if you're fighting a major battle. I mean, you need everybody to act as one, at least as much as possible, and having two separate commands, basically two separate armies, really isn't usually the best way to do things.
They didn't know any better. Legions were Rome's largest military unit and were supposed to act semi-autonomously. How could one general possibly keep track of what 17 independent units were doing at once?
True.
Very difficult, especially in the heat of battle.
Yeah, that's a good thing to point out. I mean, they're working with an unprecedented number of men. They really wouldn't know how to handle a force of this size. So in many ways, they were kind of winging it. Or they were using the experience and the knowledge that they previously had and applying it to this situation when, in some ways, it was not entirely applicable. In some ways it was. Of course, their experience was still important, but, you're going to command 90,000 men differently than you would 40,000 men.
The Romans had never done this before, so instead of creating legion groups, which is how modern militaries would have solved this problem, their solution was to split things down the middle and create two parallel commands that were more manageable in size.
I wonder if Caesar would have worked it out. I was thinking, because we've done a lot of Napoleon history, if only they'd had Napoleon. And then I was like, oh, what if they'd had Caesar? Caesar was a pretty brilliant and innovative guy. I wonder if he would have worked out how to deal with a force of this size better than Brutus and Cassius. I don't know.
As I said, this was probably a mistake. But it was a mistake made by both sides. Antony and Octavian split their commands as well.
That's not surprising. This is kind of how they knew to do things, or how they would think to do things with an army of this size. Not to mention, we have clashing egos on both sides. I think particularly with the triumvirs, Octavian and Antony are allies, but like I mentioned, that alliance is fairly shaky, so they probably wouldn't really want to work together, and they definitely wouldn't want to give command to one person. They would not have been able to choose which one of them would get command, even though Mark Antony would have been far more suited to command than Octavian.
Antony's legions arrived first, and Octavian's followed. For 10 days, there were minor skirmishes, but neither side wanted to initiate battle. Antony was positioned next to the marshes, and he decided to try to use them to his advantage. While everybody was...
Alright, let's see what he's gonna do. I always think about when we're looking at Roman history of this period, man, what would Caesar do if he was here? And I can bet you, if it was one of his better moments, because, to be fair, Caesar wasn't always operating perfectly. Sometimes he did stupid things, sometimes he just charged straight at the enemy, and through luck it worked out. Oftentimes, Caesar would find a sneaky third way of doing things. He would work his way around the enemy, or trick them into moving away from their defensive position. So I do wonder what Caesar would have done. This looks like a pretty damn impressive defensive position, but I guarantee Caesar would have worked something out. And I imagine Mark Antony is trying to channel that energy right now.
Was distracted. He sent construction crews out into the marshes to build a line of fortifications behind the tall grass. If he could get around Cassius and Brutus without them noticing, he might be able to threaten their access to the sea.
Yep.
After several days, Cassius discovered what Antony was doing. He began building his own line of defenses down into the marshes to cut...
It's the Romans when we have two lines of guys building anything, trenches, walls, any sort of infrastructure. This is such Roman activity. They just loved building and engineering and infrastructure. Just funny.
Cut him off. On October 3rd, Antony realized that Cassius knew what he was doing. That day, when both sides deployed for battle, Antony tried to distract Cassius by deploying a little closer and a little more aggressively than usual. It's hard to tell exactly what happened next, but let's just say that there were a lot of inexperienced commanders and inexperienced legions on the field, and somehow both sides ended up attacking without orders. In response, everybody ordered their legions to advance, and within minutes, a full-on battle had begun. A battle that nobody had wanted. The First Battle of Philippi.
Oh, okay, the
Brutus
first.
didn't really know what he was doing, and so his legions were spread way too thin and extended way further than they were supposed to.
Oh, no.
As Brutus advanced, the far end of his line accidentally flanked Octavian's.
An accidental flank. I love that. This really is. It's two rookies commanding armies of immense size. We have an accidental flank. I wonder if they will take advantage of that.
It's unclear why Octavian's legions didn't reposition when they saw Brutus's hyper-extended line coming their way, but maybe that's a consequence of having an absentee general.
Oh,
there
man.
was
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I do feel like someone should have seen this. I mean, there were certainly legionaries or officers on the field who had more experience than Octavian. You would think that somebody would have ordered a reposition, but I guess not.
Competence on both sides, but this time it happened to work out in Brutus's favor. Octavian's legions were almost immediately overwhelmed and collapsed. Brutus's
Yikes.
legions surged forward, but they got so distracted looting Octavian
Oh my god, they should turn on Antony's army. This could have been a total blowout, and it seems like it's not going to be.
Octavian's camp that they neglected to pursue the retreating army. Meanwhile,
yeah, they could have either pursued Octavian or literally come down on Antony's army with an immense flanking maneuver. That is not happening, unfortunately, for the conspirators.
down in the marshes, Antony's soldiers were up and out of their defenses, and before they knew it, they were behind enemy lines.
I guess this also comes back to the fact that both armies, but in this case, the army of the conspirators, is split into two independent parts. If they were, commanded with a unified command, then the other half of the army would know, hey, you either have to chase after Octavian, or probably more presciently, turn back around and close in on Mark Antony.
When Cassius's soldiers at the front learned that there was an enemy coming up behind them, they assumed that the battle was lost. And lost hope.
Man.
The historical accounts spend a lot of time talking about how bad visibility was that day, due to the clouds of dust kicked up by the armies. They had no idea that Antony only had a small number of soldiers behind their line.
So we basically have two separate disasters on each side. We have an absolute disaster for Octavian, and an absolute disaster for Cassius.
Nor did they know that, way off in the distance, Brutus had Octavian on the run.
Oh, man.
Cassius was in the middle of this madness, trying to stave off defeat and rally his legions, when a messenger informed him that the enemy cavalry had broken through and were coming his way.
Uh-oh.
If the cavalry had broken through, then the battle had been lost. Cassius called his attendants to his side and instructed one of them to end his life.
Oh, no.
It was his birthday.
Bruh, come on. This is becoming tragicomic. I mean, this is a real comedy of errors type situation. It's hilarious, but also like a tragic disaster at the same time. I mean, this was commonplace. We've seen this several times in the Civil Wars. Men killing themselves instead of being captured or killed by the enemy. It's just always unfortunate when you have a situation like this, because I don't think Cassius is the only person to ever do this. It's always unfortunate when you have a situation like this where some drastic act, aka the most drastic act, suicide, is taken, when it just absolutely did not have to be. You definitely could have lived to fight another day. You could have come back and done this again, but oh well, that's another conspirator gone. Decimus was murdered in a rather ignoble way, and Cassius has killed himself in a pretty ignoble manner. Or at least, just not a great way to go.
Happy birthday.
Oh, Jesus.
Cassius's death was a tragedy. The approaching cavalry did not belong to the enemy. They belonged to Brutus. They had heard that Cassius needed help, and were coming to the rescue.
Oh,
the parallel command structure left Cassius totally blind to what was happening on the other end of the battlefield, and it cost him his life.
Yeah. That's unfortunate. I mean, like I said, it's tragicomic, honestly. It's a real tragic event, but it's so ridiculous that we enter into sort of the space of comedy.
But on the whole, the battle was a draw. Antony stormed Cassius's camp, Brutus stormed Octavian's camp, but casualties were not high, and apart from Cassius's death, the battle was not decisive.
Yeah, no, still a draw, indecisive battle, but the loss of Cassius, that's a big blow. I mean, if Cassius hadn't killed himself, then this would be an absolute draw, right down the middle. No side would have the advantage. And it still is pretty much a draw. I'm not sure if one side really has the advantage over the other, but, the loss of Cassius, that's a pretty bad loss for the conspirators.
Brutus wept over his colleague's body and told those present that Cassius had been the last of the Romans. He sent the body away to be buried, and kept the death of Cassius secret for several days. There was a reason for this. As I mentioned before, Brutus and Cassius held two parallel commands. Cassius's legions didn't owe Brutus anything.
Wow.
With their general dead, they might just walk away, or even worse, defect to Antony.
Interesting. That definitely shows a lack of loyalty or a lack of belief in the cause of the conspirators, and more of a personal loyalty to Cassius. If Brutus fears that with Cassius gone, they're all gonna skedaddle.
By the time Brutus informed the legions of their general's death, he had come up with an offer. If they would agree to stick around and fight under Brutus, he would reward them with a cash payout equivalent to several years' pay.
Whoa.
Plus, as an extra incentive, he would allow them to loot 2 cities on the march back to Rome.
Yikes.
To be clear, that is 2 cities under Roman protection.
What a
Brutus
deal.
was buying the loyalty of the army by letting them plunder allied cities.
That's pretty heartless, but if he feels is what he needs to do, then that's his choice to make, I guess. I will say, one, the experienced one of the conspirators is gone. Now we just have Brutus, who, even though he did win a victory against Octavian, it was more by chance. He doesn't really know what he's doing. And two, this is something we will see many times throughout Roman history. This is not the beginning of the trend, nor will this really be influential on the trend in the long run, but armies being paid off in one way or another by whoever's leading them. This will be something that will become a big problem for the Roman Empire, as emperors have to keep paying off their armies with more and more money that they eventually cannot afford to pay. So, this is something that will be repeated many times.
Which is pretty repugnant if you ask me.
Yeah.
With a deal struck, Brutus was in command of 17 legions, but he was in over his head, and he knew it. He had very little.
He was in over his head with, the half of the legions that he did have, and now he's in command of all of them. He is way in over his head.
Military experience, and no real strategy for victory. The one thing going for him was that he was still well positioned, so for the time being, he would stay put and wait for his enemy to make a mistake. In the days that followed, Antony continued to extend his defenses down in the marshes. For whatever reason, maybe inexperience or ignorance or both, Brutus moved some soldiers away from the hill that was overlooking the marsh. The grass was quite tall. He might not have even known anybody was down there.
Yeah, Brutus doesn't stand a chance at this point. First off, Antony and Octavian were able to gather more troops in the first place, so he's outnumbered. And now that Cassius is gone, I don't think Brutus has a chance to keep up with whatever Antony is doing. Antony has way more experience. As we said, he's actually pretty talented in terms of military affairs. So I think Brutus is in big, big trouble.
Somebody probably should have told him, because this was clearly a mistake. Antony took the hill and quickly reinforced his new position.
Oh no.
Days passed, weeks passed, and Brutus became increasingly frustrated. From this new position, Antony could threaten Brutus's supply lines, and there wasn't much he could do about it. Brutus held out hope for reinforcements, but they never came. When he learned that ships carrying fresh legions had been intercepted and destroyed, he fell into despair. With no viable options left, and with his tactical advantages dwindling by the day, Brutus gave the order to attack. It was October 23rd.
Okay. Brutus is in over his head. He has no idea what he's doing. The best he can do is just a full-on frontal assault, which I don't think he's going to win.
20 days after the initial clash.
And to be honest, I don't think he believes he's going to win either. He's desperate. He's losing hope. He doesn't know what else to do. This is all he knows what to do, basically.
Known as the Second Battle of Philippi, because it was the second battle and because it was near Philippi.
Oh, okay.
Both sides were pretty inexperienced when it came to warfare on this scale, and so there were no complicated maneuvers, just brute force. two sides pushing against each other like their lives depended on it. The legions under Brutus broke first. It turned into a total rout.
There was less of them. They kind of had less of a reason to fight. Clearly less loyalty, especially with Cassius gone. Brutus didn't know what he was doing. I mean, sure, theoretically it could have gone either way, but in reality, Brutus didn't have a chance at this point.
Brutus retreated and considered raising new legions and continuing the fight, but then thought better of it. He escaped into the nearby hills with some friends, where they spent several days together drinking and reciting Greek poetry.
Jesus.
At the end
I think I can see where this is going.
of the final day, he told his friends that Antony and Octavian would be remembered for their unjustness and wickedness, while he would be remembered for his virtue. He told them that while he blamed his current predicament on bad luck, he would nevertheless die a happy man.
Okay.
With that, he took his own life.
There we go. I think he would die a delusional man, frankly. That's not really how things have gone. I think Brutus is best remembered. I mean, one, obviously because of his role in Caesar's assassination. He's far more known for that than what he did afterwards. Two, because of Shakespeare's play. And I think he's sort of a complicated figure, in part remembered for his betrayal of Caesar, a man who trusted him. So, yeah, Brutus is not remembered as some virtuous saint. It's far more complicated. Antony has a complex legacy as well. Octavian is remembered for his time as emperor, more than anything else. So, that prediction from Brutus was very wrong, but he just spent a couple of days getting drunk, dancing around with his friends in some sort of manic last couple of days. I don't know. I mean, it was pretty clear he was going to kill himself with his hopelessness. And so, yeah, once again, a pretty unfortunate way to go for another important person. I mean, Cicero, Decimus, Brutus, Cassius, not to mention the legions of unnamed individuals, but still important individuals who were killed in their prescriptions. A lot of important people dying lately, and in rather often tragic, sad, or understated ways.
Back on the battlefield, the victorious legions hailed Antony as Imperator. Not Octavian, just Antony.
Well, yeah, because Octavian didn't do jack shit.
All Octavian got was insults and mockery for
Wow.
hiding in his tent,
Damn.
which is fair.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically fair. Look, I'm not morally judging these people, but I am generally, I guess, an Octavian fan. I find him interesting, particularly during his time as Augustus, the emperor of the Roman Empire. He's a fascinating guy, super influential, super important, extremely politically savvy. He was very intelligent with political strategy and negotiations, but, it's pretty clear that he wasn't that talented at military affairs. I mean, that's where Agrippa will come in. We haven't got to him yet. So, yeah, this is not his strong suit. He's obviously not very good at it. He doesn't like it. He obviously does not like being on campaign. So, I mean, yeah, I guess that's fair.
Philippi resulted in a crushing victory for the triumvirs.
Oh, yeah.
Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian now stood atop the Roman state, completely unopposed. Mostly unopposed. A little bit opposed, but we can't get into it now.
Okay.
It's hard to imagine
Oh, I think I know where we're going with that, too. That will be exciting.
how they could possibly screw this up, unless they turned on each other or something. But why would they do a stupid thing like that?
We know they're gonna do that. We know. That's a good way to end it, because we absolutely know they're about to turn on each other. That's what power-hungry authoritarian guys do, right? His reference was to Sextus Pompeius, who we're going to see next time, which I'm very excited for. That's going to be exciting. But yeah, of course they're going to turn on each other. They can't help themselves. I think particularly Antony and Octavian, they've been opposed for the longest time. I imagine there still is a tension between them, particularly with Antony being hailed as imperator and Octavian being shunned by the army. I mean, it's just obvious that they're going to go for each other's throats. I don't really know about Lepidus. It's kind of interesting in the Second Triumvirate. At the beginning at least, Octavian was the junior partner to Lepidus and Antony. But I think in the long run, and especially how this is remembered, it's always remembered as Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. He's the third guy. He's often forgotten, even by me. But yeah, Brutus, interesting fella, huh? Cassius and Decimus were fascinating too, but Brutus has been the most remembered out of the three. Like I said, I think a lot of that is due to the story of Caesar's assassination, particularly the way that Shakespeare told it. He's remembered. He has a complex legacy. I mean, in popular memory, he is really just remembered for that assassination. I think as someone who tried to do good, but also seen as someone who betrayed Caesar, someone he was close to. In a more complicated manner, Brutus is usually remembered in relation to Caesar. I've talked about before how throughout history, Caesar has also had a complex legacy. Sometimes he's seen as an impressive conqueror, someone who had the skill and did what needed to be done, sort of an image to follow for a lot of kings, emperors, leaders throughout history. But he's also been seen as a brutal tyrant, my research more focuses on the 18th century and the Enlightenment, and a lot of enlightened thinkers thought that Caesar was a brutal tyrant. They did not like him. He was not remembered fondly. But a lot of people throughout history, someone like a Frederick the Great, and this is a negative example, but someone like a Hitler, remembered Caesar fondly. They wanted to follow in his footsteps. Complex guy. Brutus, similarly, is remembered in a complex way. I mean, if you like Caesar, then you're not going to like Brutus. But for a lot of people, like those enlightened philosophers of the 18th century, many of them who didn't like Caesar saw Brutus as a hero. They wanted to follow in the footsteps of Brutus. There was a lot of talk about Caesar and Brutus during the French Revolution, for example. A lot of guys wanted to follow in the footsteps of Brutus, execute the king, take down tyranny, and found a new republic. That's what they remembered from Brutus's legacy. So, just like Caesar, Brutus has a complicated legacy, which is a lot more simplified in sort of the popular conception of everything. But yeah, fascinating video, a lot of interesting characters. I'm very excited to continue, see what happens next. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon and channel memberships for exclusive reaction content. Please leave a like, subscribe, comment, etc., etc. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.